Book 1, The Forest at the Edge of the World, Chapter 4, All Science is About Proving a Bias. I heard the debate was interesting tonight. I now wish I could have attended, Heisman Pato said as her daughter sat down at her kitchen table to a mug of warm milk. Mari fidgeted. She wasn't sure if it was because of what her mother said or because of the new sheepskin coverings for the chairs that were dyed pink to match the curtains, tablecloth, dishcloths, and pink stain rubbed into the wooden cabinets. But you see, new linen arrived for my lady's sewing tonight, and what did you hear about it? Mari stared at the simple mug her mother gave her. It wasn't one of the expensive kiln-fired cups. Mari didn't mind being treated like a child that night. She felt more at ease holding the mug that cost fewer slips of silver since she wasn't sure of her grip on anything. I heard the linens came from Coast, and... No, Mother, Mari said patiently. I meant, what did you hear about the debate? Oh, well, I heard, began her mother, pulling up a chair across from her daughter, that a very handsome man has come to the village. Her voice was filled with the glee of a teenager, despite her 48 years. She began to wiggle excitedly, and the tremor rolled through her round body, up to her plump face, and through her brown and gray curls. And that he took you on very handily. Mari's head snapped up. No one won. Oh, I should have, because he pretty much quit before I could finish him off, but he didn't take me on. Her mother sat back and giggled. My, so there is something there. Who told you that? The Denzels left just before you arrived. Hogel told me you did very well, but that he'd never seen you turn red so often. I told him you did that when you were little and looked at a boy, or you needed to relieve yourself. Heisman took a sip from her shiny cup. Her mother was often a rich source of information, the most embarrassing kind, unfortunately. Mari buried her face in her hands. Oh, Mother, you didn't. Well, it's true, she said, unsure of why her daughter was upset. So, was he handsome? How should I know? Mari wasn't truly lying. She was just asking another question. She reached for a piece of bread from the basket and noticed a layer of herbs encrusted on it. She never understood her mother's need to embellish everything, from her head to her food. Heisman also insisted everything should be a meal. That meant taking 3 extra hours and 12 extra ingredients and stirring them into something that no one would recognize anymore, then giving it a made-up name like lasagna. Then again, it was her job as the head cook for Edge's Inn, the finest establishment north of Mount Seen, as its sign proclaimed. There wasn't much competition. Edge was the only village north of Mount Seen, and the other inn, misleadingly named Inn at Edge, served food that they culled from Edge's Inn's trash heap, or so Heisman claimed. You know, the rector said the new officer comes from an army family, something like that. Edge's finest cook vaguely waved her thick hand. His father did something with someone with the new administrators, maybe. Mari sighed. The only way her mother would become interested in politics was if they started taxing polka dots or cucumber slices. Is he related to a general? She suggested. During the walk from the amphitheater to her mother's, Mari tried to remember where she had heard the name Shin before. There was only one man she thought of, but the captain certainly couldn't be his son. Her mother looked up at the wood plank ceiling for an answer. General, maybe? That's the highest rank, right? Yes, Mari said slowly. Her mother shook her head. Doesn't sound familiar. Anyway, he's supposed to come from a good family. There. Mari gave her a flimsy smile and took a taste of the bread. She couldn't define any one flavor in it. Not that it was bad, just complicated. Everything seemed unnecessarily complicated tonight. Anyway, Heisman said again, Rector Denzel, said the colonel. Captain, Mari corrected. Whatever, was the kind of man your father would approve of. Heisman put her hand on top of Mari's. When you decide you want to marry him, I will help pick your linens." "What, Mother?" Mari spluttered. "What are you doing? I debated the man just once, and you already have me. She stood and circled her chair like a disoriented fly. Why was it she could debate anyone in the village, but could rarely get her mother to understand anything? Heiseman looked at her sadly. "It's just that you aren't that young of a woman anymore. To find a man not intimidated by you is— Wait, oh no. What did you say at that debate? Oh, Mari, you didn't ruin your chances with the corporal by being smart, did you?" "Mother." Mari tried to calm down by taking a deep breath. She chose not to correct the rank mistake again, but instead put on her kindest dealing with small children expression before saying, "I came to you tonight because I wanted to be comforted. And I wanted to, I don't know anymore. What's so wrong about being smart? That's what Father encouraged." "And he was much better at listening to you than I ever was," her mother sighed. "You have a question about what to put on the table for a group dinner? I'm your woman," she said with a happy smile that dimmed. "But you have a question about why something is right or wrong? You needed to talk to your father. He kept me balanced." Mari often wondered why her parents got together. Then she remembered that her father loved all kinds of foods, and he really did seem to adore her silliness, and everything. Mari took her chair again, and the women sat in silence. Eventually her mother spoke. "You would do well with the man to help keep your balance. Yes, I know you're very balanced, but a good man will help you improve the balance. I miss Cephas's knowledge, his always wanting to do right. Sometimes when I hear you speak, it's like I'm hearing him. Maybe that's why I don't go to the debates too often." And she adored him, Mari thought. He could explain anything to her, and she absorbed it all. Mari seemed only to sloppily splash words against her mother. Of course she would miss him when she listened to her debate. Mrs. Pato sighed. "That's not the entire reason I didn't go. I'd just rather look at cloth with my friends. I am sorry," she admitted with an apologetic grin. Mari chuckled. Heiseman sometimes acted as if her head were full of bubbles, but at least they were honest bubbles. "I'm sorry, Mari," she repeated. "I didn't mean to marry you off tonight. I just worry. I wasn't lonely for the 16 years I had your father. I hate to think of you lonely for your whole life." "As long as I have my students and you, Mother, I'll never be lonely," Mari declared. But tonight, those words seemed strangely empty. Several roads away, the old rector and his wife wearily entered their back door after a long evening of visits. Mrs. Densel lit a candle on their eating table, and her husband gasped. The flickering light revealed a large figure in dark clothing filling the doorway between the kitchen and the gathering room. Mrs. Densel whimpered. "It's unsafe to leave your doors unlocked now that garter activity has increased." Hoggle Densel expelled his lungs and shook his head. "Perrin, Shin, have you ever heard of knocking and waiting for a response?" He chuckled nervously and pulled out a chair, gesturing for the captain to join him at the table. "Truly, Perrin, frightening an old woman like this," Mrs. Densel scolded with a broad smile as the captain sat down. She turned to a cabinet, took out a plate loaded with a large piece of berry pie, and placed it in front of him. The captain started to refuse it, thought again, and accepted the fork she offered. "Thank you," he remembered to say before adding, "but I'm not here for your pie. I'm here for an explanation." He took a bite and glared at the old man while he chewed. The rector's wife pulled out a chair to sit across from her husband, who was practicing his best "What have I done?" look. "An explanation about what, my boy?" Rector Densel sounded genuinely unsure. Perrin swallowed. "About tonight. About, he waved his fork. "Miss Mari Pato?" Perrin took another bite. "Yes," he mumbled, jabbing his fork at the old rector. "Some old schoolteacher." "That's what you said, Hoggle. The old schoolteacher." Mrs. Densel looked down to hide her smile. Hogel put on a thoughtful expression. Well, now, many of the younger children think of her as old. Perhaps that's what I meant. I know what you're doing, Perrin said, shifting his gaze between the two of them. And I'm not here to get married. I'm here to command the new fort. And to eat your pie, delicious as always. He smiled at Mrs. Densel. She beamed, adding more creases around her ever-twinkling eyes. My boy, no one said anything about marriage. Dear, did you say anything about marriage? Hogel asked his wife. Just so you both understand, I'm not the marrying type. Ah, Perrin, said Mrs. Densel, patting his hand. Everyone is the marrying type. They just don't know it until they find their type. And it's my guess that Miss Murray might be your type, Hogel winked. Perrin ignored that comment and focused on the pie. And you already scheduled another debate? Oh, she suggested it, my boy, the rector told him. She's quite thoughtful, just like her father, one of the wisest men I ever knew. And she might be considered pretty, too. Looks aren't everything, Perrin muttered as he broke off another piece, but something in his voice suggested they were part of the equation. She reads a lot, tends to get a little outspoken, but I think you saw that, Hogel mused, trying to see any reaction in Perrin's face. But Perrin kept looking at his plate, pushing bits of berries around with his fork. But at least she thinks, Mrs. Densel interjected. It can be difficult to find a young woman who care for anything more than popular dress colors. When the captain didn't respond, the elderly couple looked at each other and communicated silently. The rector cleared his throat. I'm interested about your presentation of the topics. First, you received that message from Ida Mia. He's always sending me weather reports, the captain said offhandedly. Yes, curious that he should, considering that the weather we have in Edge one day is visiting Ida Mia the next. Reports should be going the other way, I would think, or perhaps he's just drawing your attention to the color of the sky. The captain didn't answer, but took another bite of pie. The rector smiled at the avoidance tactic. You wanted her to choose the color of the sky topic, didn't you? Did you decide that before or after you laid eyes on her? Perrin shrugged without looking up. I don't know what you're talking about. Another bite of pie. Of course not, Hogel said with a slow nod. She did rather well, I thought. Took you on quite handily. Knowing her in about 5 more minutes, she would have humiliated you. Maybe that's why you cut the debate short. Perrin stopped swirling around berries and stared at his plate. But you made great strides in proving to the village that you and the army are not lingering death tools of the kings, Hogel assured him. You even earned a few smiles, nods of approval, and one hearty round of applause. Excellent work tonight, my boy. Perrin just studied his nearly empty plate. You know, the rector said with a chuckle as he arranged some of the dishes set for their breakfast, I was just thinking, Mari doesn't live too far away from here. Just north and east, rather along the way to the fort, I would think. It's rather easy to find her house. It's the only one without a proper garden. The woman cares nothing for maintaining her yard. She cares only for her books and her students, of course. When this failed to draw any kind of response from the captain, Mrs. Densel tried. I was just wondering what color Mari's hair could be described as. It's too dark for blonde and too light to be brown. I have the same question about her eyes. I'm not really sure what color they are. Perrin stabbed the last piece of pie with more effort than needed and said, greenish-gray, but more green. Then put the fork in his mouth. Something in the air suggested he decided not to add with little flecks of golden brown. The rector and the wife exchanged triumphant looks. Rector Densel cleared his throat to begin again when Perrin finally looked up. Please don't do this, he said in a low voice. I don't need to be made to look a fool in love in my first major assignment. Oh, come now, Perrin. How can we make the son of the High General of Idemia look like a fool? Mrs. Denzil asked. She looked at his empty plate and slapped the table. I almost forgot. She stood up, took a mug from the cabinet, turned to the cold cellar, and filled the mug with milk. Perrin's hand automatically went up to his forehead in embarrassment as she placed the mug in front of him. I know what you're going to say. Milk's for children, but you've always eaten my pie with milk. Perrin slowly shook his head and fingered the mug. I'm not a child anymore. And if I want to find a wife, I can do it on my own. If... He gulped down the milk. Mrs. Denzil smiled. That's not what your mother said. By the way, I'm writing her tomorrow, and I'll tell her how nice you look tonight. She took a dishcloth, licked a corner of it, and rubbed one of the shining silver buttons on Perrin's chest. He respectfully accepted her grooming, nodded a thank you when she finished, then pushed away his empty dishes and stood up, adopting a formal stance. I need to be getting back to the fort. It should be completed in the next few days, but there are many details that need to be addressed. Perrin leaned over and kissed the rector's wife on her forehead. Thank you again for the pie, Auntie Tabbitt, but can you please try to do something about your husband? The rector grinned and pointed at his forehead expectantly, his eyebrows bouncing up and down. Perrin gave him a playful glare, put on his cap, and left out the back door. The rector and his wife watched him close the door. Then Tabbitt kicked her husband under the table. Hogel, I said be subtle. Subtle, do you know what that means? The rector feigned pain at her gentle kick. But dear, he's 28, and we're in our 80s. We don't have time to be subtle. Did you notice he talked about marrying at least twice? It was 3 times, I'm sure, Tabbitt giggled. Outside the door, Captain Shin listened in on his great aunt and uncle. He shook his head at their banter and smiled as he left. He walked the alley that ran behind the houses. One of the reasons he came to Edge was because of the Denzils. But Hogel's idea of help was distracting him from his work. No other captain had been given so much responsibility. Then again, there was no other son of the High General, who was also the grandson of a High General. He had to make a good impression early, not only with the villagers, but with the army and the administrators. Someday, once the fort was established and the threat of garters was again subdued, he could see himself looking around. By then, he'd be about 30, 10 years older than most available females, but there still might be some close to his age. Miss Pato seemed to be older, and fairly attractive and smart, so I wish she's still single. Something must be wrong with her. Then again, she might think the same thing about him, if she thought of him. He took another turn, then another. It wasn't as if her home was out of his way. He needed to walk past it on the way back to the fort. After all, it was his duty to learn every road and alley and edge so he could defend the village against the raids that may be coming. Still, he felt guilty when he found himself in front of her dark home. The tiny yard had no distinguishable pattern to the foliage, but maybe that was because the sun had set a while ago. The house was typical for smaller houses, large stones for the foundation, smaller stones mortared together for the main floor, and broad planked boards for the second-level bedroom and attic, with a pitched roof covered in sun-dried tiles. It was small and neat, with windows of thick wavy glass. In Sands, the glass blowers were developing much thinner panes to import to Idemia, but no one else besides the forts needed to go to such expense. Neither did Miss Pato, he nodded in approval. He paused only for a moment to glance surreptitiously at the windows that revealed dark nothingness. He walked slowly to the end of the road that led directly to the fort and stopped. Where would she be this hour of evening? He felt concerned for her safety, as a captain should, and turned to walk down past her house again. Perhaps she was home, but had already retired for the night. Was she ill? That might be his responsibility too. Maybe he should knock on her door and make sure that she was well. But what would he say when she opened it? Just making sure you're still alive? He reached the end of the road and immediately felt like a foolish 14-year-old. He turned again to walk past her home the third time and onto the fort. But again he slowed down as he passed her yard and looked into the dried weeds for any sign of trouble. Strangely disappointed, he picked up his gate, marched past the next house, and turned onto the fort. From behind a large evergreen shrub across the road, Mari finally felt enough courage to step out from her hiding spot and watch the dim figure of Captain Shin walk away. She'd seen him pass her house twice. What might have happened if she hadn't spent so long at her mother's? Was he attempting to find her house? Or was he lost? Oh, that did not bode well for the safety of their community, she thought with a wry smile. She tiptoed across the cobblestones to the corner of the road to catch the last glimpse of him. Instantly, she felt ridiculous about the entire thing. How would he even know where she lived? One part of her wished she paid closer attention to how her silly students stalked the young men outside the amphitheater. The other part wanted to slap her on the face and send her to her bedroom in disgrace. Standing in the shadows across the road from Mari Pato's house was a slender man in dark clothing. He watched her as she went through her front door. Then he quietly slipped from his hiding place and slinked down the main road to the new fort, observing the captain's progress. The report he'd be sending would verify the captain's arrival and an apparent intent to stay, as well as his defense of the administrator's positions at the debates. But the report would also describe his unusual behavior tonight. The man smiled briefly. For someone of his age and stature, he shouldn't have been forced so far for this assignment. Once in the mansion, always in the mansion. Or so he'd assumed. He hadn't realized that stage 1 would mean leaving his well-deserved comforts to tail potential targets like a first-year learner. But this target, and those connected to him, was more important than any other. The man knew his wisdom was needed, and so were his abilities. And now he was no longer resentful about his posting, especially after so many years of dull nothingness. Stage 2 was beginning, and the North might actually be appealing, because Captain Perrin was turning out to be interesting after all. "Go bold," Mari wrote on a scrap paper late that night. She frowned at it. It should have been "go boldly," right? She'd got it wrong all those years ago. But that indicated going somewhere, and what she'd meant was be bold. But then it would have been be bold or don't be at all, which was far more fatalistic than she'd intended. She scowled at the paper. Things are so much simpler when one approaches them with the overconfident superiority of a teenage mind. Now, as an adult, she finally realized just how simplistic and incorrect her old motto had been. No, the captain had pointed out how simplistic and incorrect she was. With those deep, dark eyes, he'd looked at her with what she could only describe as patronizing curiosity, almost arrogant affection, the way one might regard a lamb tangled up in the laundry line. Ah, look at the darling little creature caught by her own stupidity. Let's see if she can get out on her own. Better yet, let's just end it right here before she can extract herself. Mari crumpled up the paper and hurled it furiously into the cold hearth. Then she reluctantly stood up and, wishing crumpled bits of paper flew more accurately, trudged over to the wall where the small white mass lay apologetically, picked it up, and tossed it into the logs, waiting for a cold morning. She blew out the candle and clumped up the stairs to bed. 20 minutes later, Mari couldn't stand it anymore. She got out of her bed, rushed down the stairs to her dark eating room, and relit the candle. Then she pulled one of the many books off the shelf, dropped it on the table, and thumbed to the back. She'd never before read the pages of supposedly interesting facts of the leaders of the world, but tonight she raced her finger across the words until she came to High General Ralph Shin. She swallowed hard as she read, married, wife named Joriana, son born in 291, the same year as her, named Perrin. She had debated, challenged, insulted, and been insulted by the son of one of the most powerful men in the world. Her head hit the table in mortification. Later that night, two men sat in the dark office of an unlit building. Their meeting was private, secret, and the most important one in the entire world. "Are you ready?" the first older man said with a shock of white hair. "Does this mean you're actually about to begin?" said the second middle-aged man in a bored tone. "It's been so long." "Question," the first man cut him off. "How will the world react to the return of their most feared enemy?" The second man sighed. "Finally, Now, the first man interrupted, holding up a finger in the dim room. "That's not the proper response. I want your speculation." "You're going to be this exact." The first man's smile dimmed. "I've spent more than 7 years preparing for this, and in the past 2 years, the entire world has been placed under very careful controls. You think I'm going to throw out all research protocols and be casual now?" His companion nodded. "Of course not. My speculation? If their return is impressive enough, then the people will panic and beg to be rescued. They'll likely cower in terror as usual." He thought for a moment. "Perhaps there might be someone brave who decides to confront the conflict himself." "Ha!" the older man exclaimed. "Doubtful. That's precisely what I'm about to prove. Granted, someone may try that once or twice, I'm counting on it, but he'll realize there's no purpose in risking his life. Not unless the army's paying him, and even then, he won't see it as enough. No one dares anything without the lure of a reward or fear of punishment." He eyed his younger partner critically. "But your naive optimism is why I chose you. I need balance, and I appreciate your perspectives, as inaccurate as they may be." The middle-aged man squinted. "Now, while I agree that people respond to rewards and punishments, I also believe they can act because of other motivations." "Oh, come now," the first older man sneered. "Don't tell me you're just like him. Next you'll try to convince me that humans have more noble traits than the rest of animals." The second man blinked. "You're still angry about that? That was what, 4 years ago?" "7, the first said hotly. "So that's what this is all about? Him?" The first man glared. "No, of course it's not all about him. We're about to embark on the most extensive research project regarding the animalistic nature of humans ever attempted. He may have initially influenced it," the old man admitted, running a hand through his white hair, unconsciously ruffling it. "But what we will accomplish is far bigger than merely proving a point to him." The second man regarded him suspiciously. "So, your purpose is to—" "Demonstrate conclusively that men are simply animals and can be broken as such." The older man rattled it off as if he'd been practicing it for 7 years, which he likely had. "What about women?" The first man waved that off. "Everyone already accepts they're only animals. Women have no more influence or thought than beyond what their men accord them." The second man smirked. "You were never married, were you?" "No, I have better things to do. So, are you up to it?" "Just one question. You will be objective about all of this, won't you? I'm a little concerned that your personal experiences—" "Show me one man who's completely objective," the older man snapped. "There's no such thing. All science, when you get right down to it, is about proving a bias. You know that as well as I do, so why should we pretend otherwise? I will be as impartial and objective as any man can be, but if I don't feel any passion for what I do, why would I do it at all? The second man nodded in a reluctant agreement. You may have a point. Naturally. Now, the first older man continued methodically, there hasn't even been one incident, yet already some villages are reporting there have been sightings. You see, he leaned forward, it's merely the perceptions of what is real that affect people, not reality. Just a suggestion of terror, and already they're trembling like a broken dog. I fear it may all prove to be too simple. He sat back almost sadly. But hopefully we'll be able to enjoy this study for a few years before the world crumbles into a cowering mess, he continued. So, the oaths have been taken. All my men have moved into place. I've already received a very interesting report, and every fort will be in operation within the next few weeks. I can see you're intrigued, so I ask you again, are you ready? Because stage 2 is. The second thought for a moment. Who in the world will be tested first? The first smiled thinly. I assume that question means you're willing to be my research partner. Take your pick. The world's under my control. That is the end of chapter 4. Doodly doodly doo. Thank you.